So once again, you're at the SGSO Network supporting transgender and gender nonconforming youth in outdoor spaces webinar with Amity Freiman and Ari Solomon. I'm excited to introduce you to them in just a moment. Oh, and I'm just seeing that the chat is disabled. I thought I enabled it. Very pesky permissions. It turned off once we started the webinar. Okay, great. Now you should be able to chat with one another and introduce yourself. So please still do that. Would love to know where you're coming from. So if you go to the next slide, please, just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to share in the chat here in just a moment after we get your intros, a link to our resource handout, which will be helpful for you all. We've got a ton of amazing resources and links, background information to share with you all today. It will also have a link to the slides so that you can have them after the webinar. We will also be recording this webinar, so if you have to jump early or if you'd like to share it with one of your colleagues that couldn't join, you will be able to access that via email after this webinar and also be available in our recording library. This will be a 75-minute webinar. We will be inviting you to share your questions throughout in the Q&A section so that we can collect them and ask them at the end. And we will also be pausing in the middle to let you ask some clarifying questions at that point. And then finally, we'd love your feedback to know how this webinar was, but also to understand what future topics you'd like to learn about. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to share a little bit about the impetus for this webinar series. We are currently in the middle of highlighting attendees from our School Garden Support Organization Leadership Institute. This is a week-long leadership opportunity for the leaders of school garden support organizations, and it is hosted by the amazing Life Lab in Santa Cruz, California, along with Whole Kids Foundation and in partnership with the SGSO Network. So one of the things that we do after the Leadership Institute is highlight leaders who attended this institute and allow them to share the topics that they're excited about and they are experts or have experience in. The Leadership Institute happens once a year. It'll be happening again this December. Be on the lookout for the application to attend the institute. They'll be coming out soon. So the next slide will show the upcoming webinars in this series. We'll be highlighting youth internships in the garden in June and bilingual family engagement in July. The next slide will also share that we have an open house next week. So if you'd like to just dive in a little bit more into who the SGSO Network is, the kind of resources we offer, and maybe just network with a couple of other folks, we try to have these on a kind of a regular, kind of quarterly or biannual basis. We'll be having one next week, so please join us. We'd also love to invite you, just in case you'll be at the Nature Everywhere conference in Madison next week. We'll also be having an in-person gathering. We seek to provide as many opportunities for you all to connect and meet with each other as much as possible. And when we're present at other national gatherings, we bring you all together for a meal and to network. So that'll be happening next Wednesday, May 29th for dinner. You can RSVP by Monday, just in case you'll be in Madison attending that event. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to our amazing presenters, Amity Freiman and Ari Solomon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tristana. Go ahead.
No, you're all good. Thank you all for joining this webinar today. Thank you, Tristana, for setting the stage there as well. We're really excited to share this space with you all. Hopefully get into the weeds a little bit on a topic that can be very broad, very narrow, very kind of all over the place, and an emerging topic for sure. So kind of wanted to preface this by introducing ourselves and just really quickly introducing kind of our experiences with this. As a reminder, we are not experts on this. Both of us are school garden folks. Both of us have some lived experiences to share. So I'll go ahead and introduce, my name is Amity. I work with the Columbia Center for Urban Agriculture in Columbia, Missouri. I'm our farm to school co-coordinator. So I plug into schools all over our district and help out with some in-classroom lessons, some in-garden lessons, and some field trips. And then
I'm
Ari, if you'd like
Ari.
to, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Ari. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm in Portland, Oregon with Grow Portland. I'm the site coordinator, so I support our garden educators and our partner schools on the site and garden side, and have experience in both outdoor and garden education specifically. Um, and yeah, like Amity said, we are not experts in this. We're hoping that this is, even though it's a webinar, we're hoping that this can start and continue a dialogue and a conversation and get folks who are both doing direct garden education and tangential to it or supporting it, thinking about this and engaging more with this topic, because it's changing and evolving all the time, and just ways for us to support kids and students and anybody ourselves out in the garden. I go to the next slide. Cool. So we wanted to just take a few minutes and get on the same page about some language and concepts that we're going to be referring to over the course of this webinar. And the purpose of this is very much not to get too in the weeds about what a lot of these definitions are pretty fluid and change and, are different depending on who you ask. So mostly this is to give you a sense for how we're thinking about these words and concepts and how we're using them, so that you know what we mean when we say these things. We will have a little short section at the end of this chunk of slides for clarifying questions. So if you have any, feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll have like a bigger section at the end for broader Q&A, but we want to make sure that there's at least some amount of shared understanding with what these concepts are. So the first one is gender. How do we define gender versus sex? Or yeah, ultimately it's not a straightforward answer. That shouldn't come as a surprise, because people maybe watching this right now being like, I don't know what gender is. It's really scary and big, or maybe it seems really simple. And so I wanted to give just a few things to think about when we're talking about gender. So gender is a compilation of socially constructed characteristics. And what that means is that there are norms, behaviors, roles, expressions, etc., that are used by the dominant culture that categorize people into different genders. An important thing to note is that they shift and they change and differ across cultures and time periods. So when you think about like the 1800s, you're thinking about what men were wearing and hairstyles and high heels. And there's all these things that even within one particular culture or one particular part of the world, they shift over time. They shift in different parts of the world, how one person is speaking, or the inflection of their voice, or their gender presentation, the clothes they're wearing, might indicate one thing in one part of the world and one thing in another part of the world. So these are really, really not, that's what people often mean when they say a social construct. It's like, it is made up and it also differs everywhere. So for those of us in the US right now, in 2024, we have like certain things that will flag to people masculinity or femininity or a mix of them or something, that might change over time and across the world. Also, our own understandings of our personal gender can and do shift over time, and that's something that's important to remember. For people will have different experiences, so I can only speak for myself when I talk about my own gender journey, but other people, it is absolutely a thing that gender can and does shift over time for ourselves too. I was debating whether or not to get into this here because it is such a kind of can of worms thing, but I do want to just mention that biological sex, like often people define there's like biological, there's sex and there's gender, and some can be indicating of different things. Just want to also name that biological sex is also not binary. We'll be touching a little bit more on that later. Intersex people exist. There's a lot of different variation that also, we'll reference more later, but I want to just kind of make sure to reiterate here that this is not a like, well, biological sex is one thing and gender is another thing. Yes, and also no. And the next point sort of talks about that. Distinguishing sex and gender ultimately also enforces a male and female binary. So a lot of people will say like, okay, well, that person's gender is this one, but they're like biologically female or they're biologically male. And again, without getting too deep in the weeds of that gets down a dangerous path, because that can, that is like the basis for a lot of TERF behavior, TERF meaning trans exclusionary radical feminism, folks who sort of say like your physical characteristics determine your gender and determine the category we're going to put you in, no matter what you say. And that's not how we like to talk about gender and talk about ourselves. And so wanting I'm intentionally trying to muddy the waters a little bit because it just isn't as simple as like, biologically there's male female stuff, and gender it's like everything. It's like both of those things are more complicated than just one binary. Could write a lot of books about this, and many people do and have. So one thing I wanted to flag, this will be in our resource handout that is going to be shared after, that Tristana put together. Julia Serrano is someone who I look to a lot. She's a trans woman who has written a ton of articles. She wrote Whipping Girl, which is like one of her most famous books. She has a lot of articles on Medium that get more into like biological sex myth stuff. So if you're interested in, if you're like, wait a second, I thought that yes, there's biological sex and also there's gender. And even though we don't, like, if you're interested in learning more, I've learned a ton about this from her. And so I would just super recommend that. Again, we'll have the link for that in the resources. Yeah, so like I said, we're not looking to get too stuck or like debate these definitions. This is mostly like giving you a sense for what our frameworks are coming into this, so that when we refer to some of these things, yes, there are primary and secondary sex characteristics in biology and in humans and all these things. And that is a big, wide, expansive web of stuff. And so we're trying to not get too like pigeonholed into those categories. Okay, whew, we made it past gender. Transgender, also not straightforward. Let's get into it a little bit. One definition, this is by Julia Serrano, the most commonly accepted umbrella term for people who transgress gender norms or defy traditional gender categories in some way. That's pretty broad and vague, and that's intentional. So broadly, a person who identifies and or lives as a member of the sex other than the one they were assigned at birth. The prefix trans is from Latin, which means across or beyond. We'll talk about cis in just a minute. So broadly, trans and transgender, referring to folks who are just like transgressing gender norms. And that can mean a lot of different things. If you ask multiple trans people what their definition of trans is, if they use that term for themselves, you're going to get a lot of different answers, and that's great and that's okay. So mostly we're less so saying like their gender is different than their sex. Like we're not really using it that way. We're mostly saying people who are transgressing gender norms. The title of this webinar has transgender and gender nonconforming. They're not specifically conforming to any of those categories. So we're keeping it kind of broad and an umbrella term here intentionally. Gender nonconforming refers to people or behaviors that defy societal gender norms, similar and definitely tangential to trans. Sometimes used as an alternative umbrella label for transgender or gender variant people, especially when describing children, because children might not yet, or they might not identify or define a specific gender identity for themselves. So gender nonconforming can just mean like they're just not really conforming to gender norms or stereotypes or something that might be expected of them or assumed of them. And those definitions are again by Julia Serrano. Cisgender describes people who are not trans. Incredible. Easy. The flip side of the trans definition is a person who does identify and or live as the sex that they were assigned at birth. And quick notes about this is that the way that people are assigned at birth often it's simplifying. It's ignoring intersex people. It's sort of looking at a couple different secondary characteristics and looking at specific things about a baby and saying, okay, you're going to be either in this category or this category, even and especially when it's maybe not that simple. And so if you're interested in looking at that, I would look into stuff the intersex community has written and put out a lot of information about intersex erasure and ways that assignments at birth by doctors and hospitals or by folks who are present for births can do a lot of that of like, we're just going to put people into these categories, and it sort of reinforces the idea for a lot of us, how we were raised, that there's just like two options, male or female. So knowing that, cisgender often is used to describe people who do identify and or live or present or do those norms and behaviors as the sex they were assigned at birth. And that prefix cis comes from Latin meaning on this side. So like on the same side. That's where those come from. Youth. That is in the topic of, this broad category. We will use that term a little bit differently depending on some things. Our programming is mostly K-5 with a little bit of preschool stuff and starting to get a little bit older. So a lot of the things I'm referring to are mostly for elementary and younger ages, and Amity might refer to some ages that are a little bit broader than that. So we'll just make sure to clarify as we go. The last one I want to just touch on is non-binary. This is also an umbrella term that's often used to describe gender identities that are just outside of the male and female binary. It's not, I encourage you to not just think of this as like male over here, female over here, and non-binary is right in the middle. Like non-binary can be outside of that. It can be both of those things. It can be neither of those. It can just be like a big, again, ask a lot of non-binary people how they define non-binary, and you get a lot of different answers. Generally understood to be under the trans umbrella, many people who identify as non-binary will also identify as trans. Not all of them, but often that is understood to be under that umbrella. There's also a cool thing of like, what about the cis trans binary? Usually when people are referring to non-binary, they're referring to the male-female binary and saying, I'm not part of that. But what about the cis trans binary? Maybe there are people who don't identify within that binary. Our world is full of false binaries or mythical binaries. And it's really, for me, I hope that this feels exciting and not an overwhelming, daunting idea that, oh my God, well, what is my understanding of this world if I thought that cis and trans are mutually exclusive and those kinds of things. And for me, that's part of the excitement about thinking about gender and hearing about other people's experiences and journeys with their own gender, thinking about my own experience and journey. So there can be a lot of binaries that people are talking about. Some people don't like using that term because they don't want their own gender identity to be like a negation of something. They're like, I don't want to be, I am a non-something. I want to be like a something, right? And so just to give a little bit more food for thought, but broadly, yeah, binary is just identities often used, most often I think used outside of the male-female binary and within and tangential to trans umbrella. Okay, whew, that was a lot. I think we now don't have the next thing is going into yours, Amity.
Yeah, we kind of wanted to provide a brief little pause here
Yeah.
just to see if there were any questions from the chat on any clarifications there. Obviously, that's a lot. We don't need to dig super in the weeds like Ari was saying, but kind of want to make sure we're sort of all on the same footing going into the rest of the presentation. Because I'm screen sharing the presentation, I don't have the chat up. Ari, are we getting any questions in there?
We don't have any right now. We can leave it up for a minute or so. I know that was just a lot of information to come at you. And so again, this isn't necessary. We're not looking to open a space for like debating those things. It's mostly we want you to not feel lost in those definitions as we continue talking about trans and gender nonconforming youth. So if there are any things, you can pop them either in the chat or in the Q&A section and we can do it. But we'll leave this for a minute just so people can like digest for a second. We're doing okay on time.
Fantastic.
One thing I'm seeing, yeah, that's a good question. Is there a word or phrase that people like or use or identify rather than non-binary? A ton. There are a ton. A lot of people it depends on what they're talking about. Like you can oftentimes people will say like transgender or cisgender are like descriptors of what your gender is. So like I'm a transgender person who identifies as this, or like you are a cisgender male or a cisgender female. Some people will just say I'm trans and like that's as far as I want to go. And so there isn't like a there's like in the Indigenous community, often two-spirit is a term and phrase that's used which is sort of similar to someone just put this question there about two-spirit. Do you use two-spirit to address Native American youth who might see themselves as two-spirit? Similar to any of these things, like we're not trying to put labels on students until they tell you first what they want to be called. So this is a big thing, and we'll talk about this more later, of not a lot of, if you take away one thing from today, it's like, don't assume anything about who your students are and where they're coming from, and let them tell you. And the garden and outdoor spaces can be in a really amazing place for students to start thinking about that, and for kids to start, and adults, anybody, to start opening up their own thinking and shifting maybe how they see themselves. So if a student is saying, I'm two-spirit, then yeah, totally. Or you can ask them, like, do you want me to refer to you that way as well? We often don't, there's a lot of gender neutral terms, just to foreshadow a little bit, that don't need to, we don't always say, oh, well, my cisgender female student the other day right? Like that would seem so silly, because it's like, why do I need to say that? And similar, it's like my transgender two-spirit non-binary kid the other day was saying, it's like overkill, right? You don't need to sort of always use a term unless there's a kind of reason to, but both for two-spirit and other and other people, I would just say, like, following other people's lead and taking their, like, just because someone uses a specific pronouns, it doesn't actually tell you anything about their gender. It just tells you what pronouns they use, for example. And so it's still helpful to just wait and either ask if you need to know, or wait until they're telling you. There's a couple other questions that are coming in that I can read in Amity if you want to chime in also. Uh-huh. Okay, cool. So here's a question. Will you define trans again? With cis, I was taught it was defining biological sex to gender for trans people. I feel my definition from college is outdated or insensitive. My dad always asked about one of my trans classmates. I would say cis female transition to male. Is that correct? Yeah. Amity, do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to jump in? That's a good.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull back up the definition that we're
Great.
using for today, just in case that's helpful as well.
Great.
Definitely, uh, kind of, I don't know if necessarily outdated language, or how we want to look at that, but there's probably both less clunky ways to communicate the same thing, and maybe things that are a little less private to reveal about someone's identity right there. So generally, it's understood, if someone identifies as a trans man or a trans woman, regardless of what sex they were assigned at birth, or if they were intersex, or whatever kind of their history was, that title's already telling you kind of enough about them. There's a lot that can be said about AFAB or AMAB or other language that we might use to discuss how folks were assigned at birth. Generally speaking, I haven't heard the cisgender at birth assignment used before. I'll also say this is one of the many things that gets fuzzy, and different people are going to give different answers on. So unless your friend was identifying to you directly that way, that's probably language I would steer away from. I will also say that there are people in my life who kind of do want to highlight, for whatever reason, the sex they were assigned at birth, either as, an AFAB non-binary person who's trying to highlight having grown up in traditionally feminine or female spaces. There can be a lot of different reasons people might want different language used. But generally speaking, kind of the way Ari had alluded to, we wouldn't necessarily refer to our cisgender female student mentioned something the other day. Leaving those details out, unless they're self-identified, tends to be sort of a best practice. Or is
Yeah.
there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think, again, like, there sometimes folks will go, like, in the AMAB or AFAB, which stands for assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. A lot of times, people will say, like, this is an AFAB non-binary person, of like an assigned female at birth non-binary person. And it's like going out of your way to still put someone in the binary when, like, it's not necessary to, and it doesn't matter ultimately if what someone was assigned at birth. And it's, in some ways, it feels like a sort of highlight of, like, focusing on, like, okay, but, like, what are the characteristics, what chromosomes do people have, what genitals do people have? It's like all these things that it's like, there's such a fixation on it. And I understand that it can be uncomfortable and it can be new and different to move about the world and like unlearning. It's a lot of unlearning for all of us of the categories and the ways that we're sort of assigning people all the time. So, you know, it's like, I think as far as referring to people, whether that's people in your own life or students or kids or something, if there's a trans classmate, like if there's a reason to highlight that they're trans, like oftentimes it's like kind of irrelevant information. If you're just talking about them, like, oh, we went out for coffee, it's like going out of your way to say they're trans. Like, would you do that for a cis friend? Are you doing that for all of your cis friends too? Well, like I went out with someone the other day and like they're cis and they're also white and they're also that, like, are you using all the labels for other people in your life, or are you just highlighting the like non-traditional or, you know, that kind of thing? So yeah, I would say I would mostly just kind of similar. It's like, I don't know, outdated or insensitive. I don't know. I mean, language shifts all the time and shifts over time for sure around gender stuff. There are older, like people of older generations might still use the words like transsexual or things that like current, you know, discourse often has moved away from those terms. And so it's not just like, I'm not going to tell an older trans person who's identifying themselves as transsexual that that's like insensitive when it's their own, that's how they grew up, right? So I know that's maybe not the most clarifying answer, but mostly to say like we're just trying to not kind of box people in as much as possible, and we don't need to go out of our way to tell people they're trans. And in general, it's not good practice to like go out of your way to like tell people what someone was assigned at birth, because it's just like really never relevant information unless you're like their doctor and you need to know their medical history, you know. The last thing we'll do, and then we're going to move on for now. Thank you for all these clarifying questions. Oh, I haven't been looking in the chat. Okay, cool. So another question was about they, them, or yeah, to my they, them friends, gender neutral names. I say brother, girl, stuff, buddy, any ideas? We'll talk about that a little bit later. Amity will reference like gender neutral language that you can use in the garden. So we'll pin that for now and we'll get to it. And someone mentioned in the questions, it's like a dead name or a dead sex. Potentially, a lot of trans people will use the term dead name, which might refer to their name they were given at birth that they no longer use. I personally don't identify that, or like for me, that language doesn't feel good. And that's just from my own personal experience of like the way that I was raised and the name that I used to use and all these things, the pronouns I used to use, like those are part of me and they're part of my growth and journey. And so I don't consider that old self of however many years ago to be like a dead self. Some people totally do, and that's fine. And so I would, again, it's a lot of this will come back to like, we're just not assuming, and we're letting people share about themselves and share about their own journey as much as possible. And yeah, it is like if you happen to know the former name or former pronouns of somebody or what they were assigned at birth or something, it's just like not information that needs to be shared. It's similar to like, you know, some like medical history stuff or like some intense family history or something about somebody. It's like, we just don't need to, it's like not our stuff to share with other people about someone else unless there's like really a specific reason to, which usually there isn't. So mostly I would just say to answer all these questions, like we're not assuming as much as possible. We're letting people share with us. We're letting kids share with us. We're trying as much as we can to just not put anyone in boxes. And yeah, and we don't need to identify, like partly that gender neutral language comes into play of like, you can just say, this is a person, this is a student, that's gender neutral. There's no need to like clarify, again, unless you're specifically talking about something where that's relevant, which most of the time it won't be. Yeah. Thanks for these questions. You can feel free to keep putting stuff in. We'll have time again at the end. And thanks for wrestling with these things. These are hard. And I really, truly want to reiterate before Amity starts sharing that we're not at all trying to scare people away. We're not at all trying to make sure that people know like this is a field of landmines that you're going to step in. Like we are going to mess up and we are all learning. This information is also shifting. Discourse is shifting all the time. And so, yeah, approaching it with curiosity and care and learning and reading some, you know, we can, in the resources, there's going to be some follow-up stuff about that. Yeah, similar to any other like identity that you're learning about that you don't share. It's like a lot of just, I want to know what that's like for you and for that community and, you know, people, especially now with the internet being so accessible and having so much information on it, podcasts and articles and social media, there's usually a a good chance you can find some direct stories from people and direct writing from people in this case or in other situations that can help you learn more about it. So yeah, thanks for these questions.
Awesome. With that, I am going to go ahead and start to transition, no pun intended, to the next topic here, which is kind of getting into why we're talking about this at all today. So I know there have been sentiments expressed to me before and to others before of like, I only work with elementary school kids, or I've never worked with a trans student, or I'm not going to be working with any trans students. Kind of why would I need to know any of this stuff? Why bother? So really just wanted to highlight like you probably have worked with a trans student at some point in your life. Um, Kind of wanted to highlight just some demographic comparisons here. So among a group of 10,000 American youth, and that's defined kind of through the main categories that the census does it through, Pew does it through. So this will be a slightly different definition of youth, like Ari said. It'll be a little bit context dependent what we're talking about here. But among a room of 10,000 American youth just selected at random, you would expect to see about 80 people who are Indigenous, about 140 people who identify as transgender, about 170 people who are Jewish, and about 170 people who were unhoused in the last year, as well as 170 who are intersex. So you're probably not necessarily serving 10,000 people a year, but when we're looking at 1.7%, 1.4% with folks who identify specifically as transgender, that's going to come up. These are probably communities that you've been interacting with, and kind of wanted to highlight like a lot of times you may not know you're interacting with a transgender person, and that transgender person, particularly when it's youth, may not have worked that out for themselves yet as well. Like Ari said, when we're talking about gender non-conforming youth, that can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people, but generally kind of functions a little bit as a catch-all label. Some research that I read up on would consider someone who presents more as a tomboy. That's kind of a classic trope here as a gender non-conforming youth, even if that person continued to identify as cisgender both in youth and in adulthood. And that was just a different way of presenting their gender. Maybe more traditionally masculine interests emerged at some point. Whatever it is, that doesn't necessarily define them. Other sources would not use that as an example of a gender nonconforming youth. So it's a little bit all over. Generally speaking, I also try to avoid the language of identify as transgender. You'll notice that I don't mention folks who identify as Indigenous on here, or folks who, identify as rural. These things have important definitions, and that identity as transgender can come across as potentially invalidating for folks, that this is just something that I think about myself as opposed to the way I exist in the world. The reason I wanted to highlight it here is that when you broaden that question, uh, you know, we're talking about transgender to mean a broader umbrella today than some folks would self-identify with. So if you broadened that umbrella and asked that same room if they identified as transgender or non-binary, and that was the direct way that that question was written, it goes up to about 5.1% of youth. So roughly, 1 in 20. This is something that varies across states, varies across rural-urban divides. It's not going to be perfect. None of this sampling will be, but that's a pretty significant portion of the youth that you may be working with. Even if that 5%, may feel a little bit high for the community that you're in, it's a good reminder that this is a quickly growing population. The majority of folks who do identify as transgender or non-binary on those survey questions when asked are in this ages 1 to 24 category. This is something that for a lot of folks may be kind of uncomfortable or may not feel necessarily valid because it's kind of a newer thing to be talking about. Trans people have always existed, non-binary people have always existed. But as Ari was mentioning, specifically how folks self-identify, how folks are reported on, um, it's varied across ages. It's always existed, but that terminology and that self-identification has changed, as well as the safety of identifying that way and the access to information. There may be folks in older generations who may have glommed on to terms that are used today, may have used their own terms, but that society that we're brought up in, that language that we learn to self-identify with, ends up impacting how we identify in things like these surveys. So, at this point, it is more common if you're just looking across the board to be working with a youth, again, 0 to 24 here, who answers yes to that, do you identify as transgender or non-binary question, than it is to be working with someone who lives in a rural neighborhood or an ESL speaker or a lot of these other kind of demographics that we talk a lot about in trying to support through garden education. And to kind of loop back as well to that question of, well, maybe for Ari's sake or for others' sake, you're only working with folks who are aged K to 5 or maybe even younger. Most of the peer-reviewed research that exists suggests that the earliest onset of some form of gender dysphoria, some form of identifiable emotion or feeling or behavior that is specifically not in line with, and again, kind of awkward to talk about wording wise, but is not in line with whatever you were assigned at birth, whatever that transcoded behavior or that gender dysphoria is usually onset between about 5 and 8 years old. For the majority of trans people surveyed in some surveys, not all of them, it hasn't been consistent, but that frequently is the earliest memory reported among all memories, is some moment where the gender that they were assigned societally did not gel with what they were feeling or identifying as, and can present as young as 3 years old. So I think it's really important that we kind of acknowledge that. We acknowledge that these folks, particularly at those younger ages, 3, 4, 5 years old, aren't going to have the language to self-identify as transgender or non-binary. But there may already be emotions presenting. There may already be hurt feelings. There may already be euphoric feelings that we can try and support our youth through, try and support the communities that we work with. And I think that's really important to center here, just because I have heard that kind of, like, why are we even talking about this rhetoric used quite a lot. So we got into this a little bit with Ari's as well. But there are some really easy changes to make to start to support folks in your settings. So you'll notice that we have been defaulting a lot to folks or kids or students or youth, kind of your classics of introducing yourself to an audience. Folks may use boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. There's just very simple gender neutral versions of that we can kind of lean into instead. Another really big one is prioritizing those student introductions and using their names if we're not sure about their pronouns. There's no real reason to assume pronouns in most cases. It's going to be a lot more clear if you're working with a group of 20 students to be able to say, Aiden told me, as opposed to he told me anyways. That also just allows for the space for that child to know you're talking about them specifically. It's also really valuable to allow those children to self-identify to you. What I mean by that is that another kind of common practice I've run into across different organizations, maybe the first day of school, first day of summer camp, students may come in and have pre-made name tags. Those name tags may use full legal names a lot of the time, sometimes are maybe a little bit of a step ahead and have allowed a parent to fill in a child's preferred name, but really allowing spaces for those students to introduce themselves and to self-identify is a lot more valuable. My organization, even, like I said, we're learning and growing constantly. We did this last summer and we had name tags kind of made up. allowed the students to customize them, but just had little labels of like, this one's going to this kid. And we're using the preferred names provided by parents. That seemed like an open gesture of, we want to accept your children. That support doesn't always exist at home. So with one of our students specifically, they approached me and asked on day one, do we have to use our dead names at camp? It was very heartbreaking for me, and a really good reminder that, yeah, I'm still growing and learning how to support folks in my own community, in this community. Uh, and I think a good reminder, there's just work to be done, and ultimately letting those kids that you work with, letting whoever it is that you're working with tell you what their wants and needs are, is always going to be more effective than assuming what their wants and needs are, even if you're trying to be supportive. Also important to note, though, there are a lot of times I'm working with 80, 100 students all at once. I may only have these kids for an assembly or a field trip that may last 50, 60 minutes. It's not necessarily time for 100 students to introduce themselves to me in that period of time. So trying to default to genderless terms, again, folks, kids, students for a group or an audience, or utilizing things like my friend over here pointed out, or our ACE gardener, something that isn't inherently gendered. I also have in here, as they were saying, utilizing they pronouns can be helpful. I'll also say this is something that, again, maybe more of a stepping stone step. There are definitely folks who identify as transgender who do not like being labeled they, them at all, even in just kind of a transitional way that can sort of be invalidating to their identities. So generally speaking, if there's not a reason to use pronouns, try to default to names. If there is a reason to use pronouns, kind of question how much of that's real. It's generally safe to default to gender neutral pronouns, but again, that's not necessarily always going to be the case, and accepting and receiving and then acting upon student feedback is always going to be your best practice. The other thing I run into a ton in garden programs, and I am guilty of myself, again, is some of that gendered language that we were raised with. There's things just built into me. I grew up in California. Dude had always been a gender neutral term for me. It's not for everyone. That can be harmful for folks, that can be uncomfortable for folks, that can just kind of exclude people who don't necessarily identify that way. So trying to unlearn some of that can be helpful. There's also some interesting research, and we'll dig more into this in a moment. There's some interesting research that kind of shows when we default to certain pronouns for things, there are connotations that come with them. So a classic would be, there's a sprout coming up and you might say, look at this little guy growing here. There's a certain amount of reinforced gender norm just by already saying this little guy. It's more descriptive to say this little radish is coming up. It's more accurate to say that, generally speaking, something to lean into. Again, I'm not saying I'm perfect with this. I'm not suggesting that you should be right now, but I do think that it's a good kind of stepping stone, easy change to start making. Some of those next steps can be a little harder. So one of the big ones that, again, there's a lot of research on, we'll dig a little bit more into in a second, is that students are not just these empty vessels that we unscrew and we pour knowledge into, right? They're being impacted by the culture they're raised in, every other class they've ever had, the family they're being raised in, the media that they're being raised around. There's a lot that impacts the things that are coded certain ways, or the ways that students may react to or respond to presentations. So I worked a summer school course that had some cooking elements, and one of the things that we noticed and research has kind of suggested as well is if we have a chef in the group will self-assign a boy to do that role. If it's a cook, it's a girl. There's weird forms of gendering that pop up even if we haven't introduced it. And challenging those roles by alternating between differently coded terms can kind of help with that. Another kind of easy step is to discuss the problems with different binaries openly. The male-female binary is not the only one. So talking about good bugs and bad bugs is kind of your classic here, acknowledging that there aren't necessarily bugs who know they're doing good for the garden or bugs that are trying to harm our garden, acknowledging that something like a praying mantis that we would traditionally consider a good bug may also eat other good bugs, can be helpful in breaking down some of those black and white barriers. I'm going to speed through some peer-reviewed research here. I want to be respectful of our time, and I know we're running a little bit behind at this point. I'm sorry for rambling on here, but wanted to highlight some interesting research real quick. All of these will be linked in that resource document that's coming to you folks later. Wanted to highlight two surveys that were done by Decker and Morrison, the second of which came with some research as well. The first one was just environmental educators. What do you do with gender? How are you doing it? Self-identify. Most folks said they haven't really ever thought about it. Every cisgendered person who answered that survey exclusively discussed gender within a binary. The only folks who were challenging those binary gender roles were folks who already identified as transgender or non-binary on the survey. The other big thing that got into that I found very interesting is that garden educators repeatedly expressed that feminine gender roles are challenged by garden work. Girls are lifting heavy things or getting dirty, but that they don't go out of their way to challenge masculine assumptions or stereotypes nearly as much. The kind of follow-up study that they did included a survey as well, but then kind of checked on what was observable and really noticed like we're starting to do a lot of this work that the first survey said we're doing, but it needs to be much more deliberate. It needs to be much more directed. A lot of the things that educators may have self-identified as breaking down barriers may not have been doing as great of a job as we thought, or may not be reinforced at any point throughout programming and then fall apart. Again, those kids are not empty vessels. They're coming in with 1,000 different conceptions, misconceptions, preconceptions, connections that we're constantly bouncing information off of. And really trying to be deliberate with how we're doing that is how we can start to see that learning. Some really interesting papers coming out of the Journal of Environmental Education from 2017 as well. I'll kind of speed through these, but their suggestions are to shift between leading and following roles. So allowing students to present about the garden or to present about a project, encouraging group formations that don't have the same student doing the same work all the time, don't have those kind of traditional jobs. Allowing students to move around helps queer a space, helps allow some space for those students to kind of flourish and be challenged. But within that, we shouldn't be forcing students to do things they're uncomfortable with either. It argues that outdoor education is a space that can be more freeing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. Again, we have to be intentional. When we're being outdoor, though, it does involve our human communities and experiences and identities into the broader field of ecology. And that ecological understanding of gender or your place in the world can kind of help folks maybe feel a little validated. I'm gonna skip through real quick, want to highlight just two papers, and then Ari, I'll throw it back to you. But this was a really fantastic one about supporting the broader LGBTQ plus community that had a great graphic with it and starts to highlight, again, some of that gender inclusive language we can use, some gender neutral gear. This is something that's been challenged by some other papers, but providing the option, at least for non-gendered or unisex gear, can be helpful. How effective it is has been called into question a little bit, but it at least allows students to opt in if it is optional or to be on sort of a leveled playing field. Also, when we're working with the older folks we would consider youth, starting to think about, again, when do we actually need to know things about their gender or sex? Having travel accommodations, restrooms, whatever it is that are affirming and inclusive is really important for involving those students in our work. And then the last one, kind of building off of that, is Randy Hartman's work out of the Washington University in St. Louis, which really got into when trans people are working outside, there's other things that come up that don't for cisgendered people necessarily. So their work found that there's a lot of fear of how you're presenting, fear to correct others about assumptions being made, particularly fear around getting misgendered, or frustration around getting misgendered, but then also physical challenges that can come up. There are a lot of trans masculine people or trans men who may use chest binders, things to make their breasts look smaller. That can present physical limitations, particularly if we're working outdoors, particularly if we're working in the heat. And if we're not in a safe and affirming environment, that may not be something they've expressed ahead of time that they may need support with. So there were multiple people who reported some physical issues surrounding that. And then also documentation, particularly if we're going to be traveling anywhere, having to have ID that matches a legal name, anything like that can be a little less than affirming. So I would like to pass it back to Ari here. I know that was a lot. There's so much more that I've cut. This is a really evolving world. There's a lot more research that we need to do in this realm. I'm happy to take some questions about this in a second, but kind of looping back to some next steps for us, we wanted to present on some potential curriculum ideas. How do we bring all of this research into some lesson plans? So Ari, I'll pass it back to you there.
Thanks. Just for the last couple minutes before we answer a couple questions that have come through and can leave space for some additional ones, is I wanted to give some concrete curriculum ideas. Mostly these are going to be for elementary, for K through 5, but almost all of these can be modified for older students for sure. Something that our organization does in our garden programming is we have monthly curriculum themes, and one of them is about worms. And so we talk specifically about earthworms, their role in the garden, their role in the ecosystem. They're amazing, and we want to talk about them. Worms are really cool because they have both male and female reproductive parts, so there aren't girl worms or boy worms. So it's a really, really good opportunity and kind of entry point to show tangible examples in the garden of how the boy, girl, or male, female binary is constructed, and so often not the case in critters and creatures that are in the garden that we're interacting with, in ways that in plants as well. You can pretty easily and cheaply make a red wriggler worm bin that you can take around to your classes. I know garden programs are designed so differently and all over the place. So if you want some additional information, you can reach out to me after, and I'm happy to share with you what we do. But our educators have a worm bin for that month that they take around, and the kids can hold the worms and look at the worms and interact with them. And, we talk a lot about those things, but it's a really good opportunity where if kids are like, is this a girl worm or a boy worm? You can be like, that's a great question. Let's talk about that. And it's a cool way into showing them that there's actually a lot of expansiveness when we think about gender and we think about sex and whatever, all these things. So worms are a really cool intro into that. Some other just broad curriculum ideas. I just encourage you to create lots of space for exploration and curiosity, whether you're in the garden or you're in the woods or sort of outdoor non-garden spaces. Having just like room for kids and yourself, and I think modeling that learning as the educator or as an adult in the room is so important and valuable. Just asking questions, and you can even answer, like, it's okay if a kid is like, is this a girl worm or a boy worm? And you're like, I'm actually not totally sure. I don't think that worms have girls or boy worms, or, like, let's learn about it together. Like, it's okay to model that transparency that you're also learning and thinking about it. Which for me gets into a lot of other stuff around, like, I think it's so valuable to model that kind of transparency with students about anything, showing that you're also learning and making mistakes and growing. And I think gender, especially if it feels clunky for you or if you feel nervous about it, that can be such a cool way of like, let's learn about it all together and see what we find. Celebration of kids in your programs and in your curriculum or in your garden settings, thinking critically, even just noticing the ways that gender does and does not play a role in the garden, the woods, etc. Do we need to know if this tree is a boy tree or a girl tree? No. Does that mean anything? No, right? Like, boys and girls are like describing humans and not describing animals. So there's like, you can answer with questions. You can just celebrate when kids are like, I wonder why this tree or this worm or this animal is presenting this specific way or looking this specific way or acting in a certain way. Just celebrating the like wondering about that and the noticing about those things really can go a long way for kids also looking, then being like, huh, well, if that's the case, what about myself? And doing some of their own reflecting too. Any activity that can focus on body awareness and movement encourages development of embodiment skills and self-awareness, both physical and emotional. And that is always going to be a good thing, whether or not we're talking about gender. And garden and outdoor spaces are such amazing ways. It's such an embodied space anyways, especially outside of a school context where they're usually inside at a desk, maybe on the floor, but so much more embodiment and access to that kind of experiencing of the world. And so encouraging that kind of awareness, the more we can be aware of, attuned to our body, it's really helpful to then be like, huh, why do I feel really weird about maybe that one part of my body or maybe this shirt that I'm wearing, because I'm like attuning to myself. So garden spaces, I think we shouldn't overlook the ways that focusing on embodiment and self-awareness in the garden space and in outdoor spaces can really help with students' own gender journeys and awareness. Especially with younger grades, incorporating books into lessons that focus on trans, queer, and gender nonconforming kids is so amazing. We learn in stories. We experience our lives and the world in stories. Here are two books that are really amazing that you can use for reference if you like. The one on the left, I think you're also seeing it as a left, is a bilingual Spanish-English book, which is really amazing. And the one on the right is written by Kai Cheng Tom, who is an incredible person you should also look up. And so having bringing in stories, like you don't have to be the one to teach. You can look at, similar for any other thing you're trying to bring more disability stuff in. You're trying to bring different identities or cultures into your classroom, outdoor classroom. Having stories that are already written and illustrated by other people is a great way to just start the conversation and to get kids thinking. They're gonna, those of you who work with young kids especially, how much a book can influence how they're seeing the world. So these are just two examples. There are many, many more out there. I encourage you to share them in the chat. If you have good books that you already know, a lot of libraries have some. The Boston Public Library had a really cool list of like trans and queer representation in kids' books. These are ones specifically that are more like relevant to outdoor spaces or garden situations. So I wanted to put those in there. Okay, we have some questions. We have 10-ish minutes for some questions. There's one initial one that had come through a little bit ago that I wanted to talk about. That is such a good question. It's referring to on one of Amity's slides about not using like he or she to talk about as pronouns to gender, like a radish or like things in the garden. Someone said, some research points to using pronouns with animals and plants as helpful in establishing relationships and decentering humans, centering more than human life. I wonder about using they for plants and animals, and if or when using she or he for a plant or animal will be appropriate and useful. It's an amazing question. I didn't think to put this article in the resource doc, and I'm not sure if we can edit it at this point, but I'm putting it in the chat. Robin Wall-Kimmer is an amazing indigenous bryologist. She studies mosses and lichens primarily. And she wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. A lot of you probably know about her. She has, there's this article that I just put in the chat. She has a lot of stuff about using a new pronoun for specifically what you're talking about, this person's question, referencing plants, animals, more than human relations and kin. And the pronouns are ki and kin, K-I and K-I-N, as a way to reference when we're referring to anything that's a non-human relative and being. So I really encourage you to read that article and to think more about that. And I think, using they instead of using she or he, like you're right, that if we're just calling worms and trees just it, or that bird, it's doing this, it's like, it does, that does devalue, that language does devalue our relationship. And so I totally agree that using pronouns can help us also reorient our own relationship to those beings. But similar, it doesn't have to be she, he, right? We have already an established gender neutral pronoun, they, that you can absolutely use, and or you can start using he, kin. So that's a great question. Thank you for.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that really quickly as well. There was some research there that I kind of glossed over that exactly like you're talking about does suggest when kids are empathizing with an animal, they're more likely to assign their own pronouns to that animal as well. So looking specifically in that research at how students that were using he, him pronouns and students that were using she, her pronouns were gendering roly-polies. In this second paper, are these girl ladybugs or boy ladybugs? And kind of encouraging us both to honor that and acknowledge that a student may have done that, and then also to offer kind of soft correction of like, well, we don't know if that's a boy ladybug or a girl ladybug. Like, I can't really tell. That's a way to introduce your students, even potentially to those gender neutral singular pronouns. They sure are a really cool bug, whatever it may be. But also to your point, wanted to highlight kind of a neat one that usually when there's any kind of dehumanization of a marginalized person, it's rendering people animal-like, right? They're savages, they're beasts, whatever it may be. And that violent language is kind of challenged inherently by interacting with nature, by humanizing nature, by understanding humans as part of this greater, broader ecology, right? We don't have dominion over the rest of the world. We are just a part of it. And so by challenging some of those things, the way you're talking about, really allowing students to connect with things and offer them, if not personhood, certainly relevance and value at the same level as us, is a way of actually undoing some of that systemic violence that's been done.
Yeah, thanks. I want to go to another question. We have, the people are putting some cool things in the chat, so feel free to check those out. We'll try to, address all these things if we can. Someone said, I work with first through sixth graders and have been thinking about pronouns and introductions. And also I'm considering your point made about need to know in partnership with fostering an inclusive space. Do either of you have thoughts on using pronouns and introductions with youth? Yes, I do have thoughts about that. And this is relevant not just for garden spaces. This is relevant in arguably more so in like Amity was saying, sometimes you have a group of students for 45 minutes ever, and you don't really develop longer term relationships with them. So especially in situations where you are on a kind of name basis with students. One way to do it is if you're starting a go around circle, you are just modeling, hey, I'm Ari, I use they, them pronouns, and here's my check-in question answer or whatever. So that just sort of opens the door for them if a kid is like, oh, yeah, I want to share my pronouns too, or maybe they don't or something. That's one way you can do it. One way is you can be explicit. We're going to go around, you can share your name, you can share your pronouns that you want us to use. One really cool thing with kids is making sure that they know you can change your pronouns. You can change them in your life. You can change them day to day. You can change them week to week. So it can be like, what pronouns should we use when we are talking about you today? And that can just be the question. It doesn't mean you have to be, doing a big thing. Kids can try on pronouns. Having a space for trying on names and pronouns is so important. So you can make it as explicit as that if you'd like, depending on what your kind of situation is and what school, depending on all these things. One thing I want to flag about this, let me say one thing before I flag a thing. If you are in, like some of my friends who are classroom teachers, they will do a cool thing largely with older students, but I think it could still work with, 4th through 6th grade, maybe 3rd, is at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the lesson, if you're doing bigger introductions, is you can give them a paper that says, okay, what name do you want me to use in class? What pronouns do you want me to use for you in class? And that way it's not done in front of all the other kids where it might feel kind of intense for a student to say in front of everybody, these are my pronouns, especially if the students know them as other pronouns. So you can do, like, if the kids are writing and reading at that age, you can give them a paper that they can fill out so that you see it and that you can then use their pronouns that they want and the name that they want. One thing that's good to keep in mind about this is that often kids might use a name or pronouns at school or at camp or something that might not be what they use at home. And that could be a safety thing. And so if you are having that paper, especially for older grades, can be like, is this we could think about wording for that. Is this a name and pronouns that you want me to use with your family? Or is this a different pronoun that you use at home? And so you can be really, really thoughtful that you're not outing a student to their family when they weren't ready for that, but that school or camp might absolutely be a place where students can and should be able to try on those things, especially if they don't have that support at home. So just one thing to be aware of before you're sort of like, let's have everyone share their pronouns and their names, and this is so great. Like, especially students that are young, they are going to be living with their families for several more years. And it is really important to do what you can to support them, both at school and with their family. So I just want to really flag that part. Amity, anything to add around introductions and pronouns and that kind of thing?
Yeah, the only other thing I really wanted to bring up there is that, and there's not a perfect answer to it, but you will sometimes run into students who don't want to self-identify with pronouns for whatever reason. Sometimes that's just a lack of knowledge surrounding it. Don't really understand why that would be important. Sometimes though, that's a student who does not feel safe either with you, with the class, with the setting, whatever yet, to be forthcoming about that. And so really trying to, again, consider what we need to know to make someone comfortable. If you're dealing with a student that's hesitant with sharing pronouns, either privately having a conversation of, hey, I just want to make sure I'm referring to you the right way, or even just defaulting to their name is a pretty safe bet. It's really important that you're not forcing a student to out themselves to a group, or really even encouraging it past that. This is going to be a safe space, and we want you to know that it's a safe space.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, we're going to take one or two more questions. I know we could talk about this really for so long. I want to just flag one thing someone put in the chat about, like, I mentioned earlier, worms have male and female reproductive parts. Like, do we need to even label them male and female? Yeah, awesome. I love that. We can totally say, like, worms have both of these different kinds of reproductive parts that and describe what they are and that kind of thing. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's great. And same for flowers and pollen producing or fertilizing thing or whatever. Yeah, definitely there's a lot of other language we can use there. There's a question here. If a child shares something with you about their gender identity, is it appropriate to ask what pronouns they'd like for you to use? If not, what's the best approach after that kind of conversation? Yeah, I would say broadly, if a student is coming to you saying, hey, I want to share about my gender, or I'm actually a boy, I'm actually a girl, whatever it is, thank them, be so warm, be so kind, be so open, be so just, hey, I love that you told me that. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to know. I'm so happy to support, like just really, really, that can be a really scary thing for a lot of kids, not for all kids, but for a lot of people, it can be a really big thing to share. And you might be the first person they're telling. I don't know. I think it's totally okay to ask those things just to make sure. Are you still going by this name? And should I still call you these pronouns? Do you want me to shift that? It's okay if you don't know yet. One nice thing, sort of what Amity was referring to earlier, of at the beginning, like it takes time to build trust. Just because you're the educator, just because you're the person in front of the room, there's not immediate trust there. You need to earn that trust from them, not just for gender, for all things with educating. You know that as educators. So having, it's not just like, well, I asked about pronouns at the beginning of the year, so I did it. I checked it off. It's like maybe every month or maybe twice a year or, more times than just one time. You can say, that's why the language of like, what pronouns do you want to use today? Or like, what pronouns do you want? So that it doesn't have to be the kid being like, I have an announcement, I just changed my pronoun, which is like so intense. So leaving multiple opportunities for that to happen. If, especially as garden educators, we often might not see the same students every day or every week even. And so every time you see them could be a cool opportunity. It's like once a month or it's a few times a year. There's already some of that kind of space built in because you're not seeing them every day. But even if you're a classroom teacher maybe who takes your kids out in the garden, maybe every time you go in the garden, you're saying, well, let's like recheck in about, reintroduce ourselves or something. So there can be lots of room and opportunity for the pretty low barrier for kids to share that, oh yeah, actually my pronouns shifted or my name shifted or something like that.
Yeah, I wanted to share, bouncing off of that, and I know we're short on time here. But a partner organization of ours has an after-school garden club that they use. And one of the ways that they've kind of supported this is by having the students just do self-introductions every time. It's weekly. These kids aren't necessarily in the same classes. They're not necessarily going to store names anyways. So having that reminder can be really helpful. But the step past that they did that I really like and I'd like to bring into more of my own programming is allowing those students to have a garden name and letting that be the presentation. So I know they've told me a lot of times there was a student who, by all accounts, some years later, is still identifying as cisgender, just didn't like their name, wanted to go by kale in the garden. It was their favorite vegetable in the garden. And that was great. That worked great for them. That's not taking away from anyone else's enjoyment of the garden. And it was something the kids really leaned into by creating a space where those students were able to self identify every week. They were able to keep updating that. They were able to keep kind of making those changes if and when they saw fit, regardless of if it was a gender situation or not.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say before we'll transition into the close that Tristana can offer is just like a reminder to all of us that there is fluidity here, and there can be fluidity. Kids might change their names or their gender pronouns frequently, and it's not like, wait a second, you told me at the beginning of the year that you were she, her, and you were that like, okay, so what is that? Like not making a big deal out of it. Of just like, cool, awesome. Should we update your thing on your desk or your name tag or whatever you're using? Or can I call you that in front of, can I use he, him now in front of all the students? Yeah, great. Awesome. Thanks for telling, like just kind of being like, awesome. I really appreciate the additional information. One framing that I really like that I'll just maybe offer as a final thing that I found helpful in my own relationships too, like helped a lot with like my parents being on board with, or just like as I was telling them about gender stuff for me, flipping the script from like, we have this language of like people coming out, queer people coming out, trans people coming out, you're in the closet, you have to come out and share. And it puts the onus on queer people and trans people to say, okay, well, I have to tell you that you're like, I'm different than what you assumed. The flip of that can be letting people in. And so you're saying, I'm not coming out of anything. I'm letting you in to some new information that I have. I'm letting you in because I have a new name that I want to try, or new pronouns, or a new understanding of myself. And if you can see it also as that, of them letting you in, it's such an act of trust. It's such an act of care for themselves and for your relationship that they feel they can tell you about that. So approaching it with that kind of care and excitement and support, that kind of thing, I think is going to go a long way with just you as educators learning, supporting your students, all that kind of stuff.
I wanted to come in and answer a question in the chat real quick. There was someone who had asked about the number of Muslim students in the country, or Muslim youth. That was not something that had come up on the specific surveys that I was looking at. I've done some quick Googling, and it depends a little bit on the source here. I don't have time to check much into the validity of these sources, but it seems to be somewhere in the 1.4% range. That seems to be the number that's coming up right away. That's a good question. The only reason that that wasn't in there is that a common stat that's sort of cited by the intersex community would be there's about as many intersex people in America as there are Jewish people in America, or as there are redheads in America. That's something that was in some of those materials, just to give a comparison point. Didn't mean to exclude a specific religion or identity for any reason. Just kind of wanted to acknowledge that really quickly. With that, though, I think we may be out of time. So I'll go ahead and pull up these ending slides, but I really want to thank all of y'all for those questions. I know we could keep going for a real long time here.
Yes, thank you both so much, Ari and Amity, for holding this space, bringing your knowledge, what you've learned, and these amazing resources. Thank you all for the conversation, your reflections, your questions, your resources. One of you asked, and Ari mentioned as well, an additional resource. I'm kind of gathering all of these resources that you all have shared with each other, and that we've come up with in this last hour together, and I will be adding those to the resource handout and be sending out a new one via email after this. After the webinar has ended. It'll also be linked to on our website. We have a recording library for all of our previous webinars, so you'll be able to find the link to that there as well. Just as a reminder, our upcoming webinars in this series will be youth internships on June 26th and bilingual family engagement on July 31st. And once again, let me pull up the link here for our survey. It would be great if you filled out our survey so that we can understand how we did today and identify future topics and presenters that you would like to see for the future. So I'm putting that into the chat, and it's also up here on the screen. And then finally, thanks again. Here's our contact information, our website, sgsonetwork.org. You can email us at info@sgsonetwork.org and find us on all of the socials. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your day.